11. Matilda tanks rolled toward what British intelligence called a lightly defended position on the morning of June 15, 1941. 12 minutes later, only one was still moving. Major Miles of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment made one final radio transmission before his tank was torn apart at Halfaya Pass in Libya. His final message was, "They are tearing my tanks to pieces." These were the same tanks that had crushed an entire Italian army 6 months earlier. The same tanks the newspapers called invincible. British commanders knew this would happen. They had known for 13 months, and they sent those men anyway. This is the story of how Britain's most celebrated tank became a steel coffin, while the men who built it kept the assembly lines running. To understand how things went so wrong, you need to understand how right they once were. Watch what happened in December 1940. 57. Matilda tanks of the 7th Royal Tank Regiment charged the Italian fortified camp at Nibewa at dawn. The result was 2 British soldiers killed and 4,000 Italians captured in a single morning. At Sidi Barrani, a single Matilda absorbed 38 direct hits from Italian anti-tank guns and kept fighting. The rounds bounced off 78 millimeters of frontal armor, thicker than most tanks would carry for the entire war. An Italian army doctor who survived the assault described the Matildas as the nearest thing to hell he ever saw. Over the next 2 months, General Richard O'Connor's force captured 130,000 prisoners and destroyed the Italian 10th Army entirely. And the Matilda earned a name that would become both her greatest asset and her deadliest curse, the Queen of the Desert. But 7 months before those headlines, before Operation Compass, before the legend was born, something happened in France that should have changed everything. And someone made sure it did not. May 1940. France is falling. The German blitzkrieg has torn through the Allied lines, and the British Expeditionary Force is being pushed toward the sea at Dunkirk. In desperation, British commanders order a counterattack at Arras. 74 tanks roll forward, 16 of them Matilda II tanks making their combat debut. And for a few terrifying hours, it works. The Matildas rip through Erwin Rommel's 7th Panzer Division. German 37mm anti-tank guns, the standard weapon, bounce off the Matildas' armor like pebbles against a castle wall. German troops panic. Rommel himself later exaggerated the attack as 5 divisions when it was actually 2 battalions. But Rommel was no fool. When his anti-tank guns failed, he ordered his 88mm Flak anti-aircraft guns to depress their barrels and fire directly at the British tanks advancing across the French countryside. The 88mm was designed to shoot down aircraft at 26,000 feet. Against a tank at ground level, it was devastating. The gun could punch through 84mm of armor at 2,000 meters, more than the Matilda's thickest plate, at twice the effective range of the Matilda's own weapon. The Matildas at Arras were slaughtered, not by tanks, not by infantry, by anti-aircraft guns repurposed as tank killers. Now here is where it becomes a scandal. 13 months passed between Arras and Halfaya Pass. 13 months during which British intelligence knew exactly what the 88mm gun could do. An armored division commander noted in official reports that German tactics involved luring British armor onto anti-tank guns. An artillery commander specifically noted the Germans were using high-velocity anti-aircraft guns in the ground role. But nothing changed. One military analyst later concluded that the British did not put 2 and 2 together. And when Rommel arrived in North Africa in February 1941, he brought entire Flak regiments armed with 88mm guns, specifically for killing tanks. The guns were dug into the sand at Halfaya Pass with only their barrels visible, waiting. The British knew, and they sent the Matildas anyway. But it gets worse, because the tank itself had a fatal flaw that someone decided to bury. The Matilda's main weapon was the Ordnance QF 2-pounder gun. Against enemy tanks, it was adequate. The armor-piercing shot could punch through most Italian and early German armor at combat ranges. But here's what the recruiting posters never mentioned. When a Matilda crew encountered an anti-tank gun emplacement, the deadliest threat they faced, they had almost no way to destroy it. The 2-pounder fired solid armor-piercing shot. Solid steel, excellent for punching holes in enemy tanks, but useless against unarmored gun crews crouching behind thin metal shields. The shell would pass straight through without exploding. Crews had only a single coaxial machine gun to suppress positions that were killing them from a mile away. A high-explosive shell would have solved this instantly. One high-explosive round into a gun position, and the crew would be dead. And here is where the cover-up begins. A 2-pounder high-explosive round existed. It was designed before the war. It was issued to units in France. Crews used it in combat. Then, after Dunkirk, when over 500 anti-tank guns were abandoned on the beaches, production of high-explosive shells was suspended. The official reason was to concentrate on armor-piercing shot for anti-invasion defense. The suspension was supposed to be temporary. It lasted until 1942. By then, the 2-pounder was being phased out entirely. The high-explosive round never went back into production. Multiple historical sources note that a high-explosive shell was designed for the 2-pounder, but for reasons never explained, it was never placed in production. Who made that decision? Who maintained that suspension for 2 years while Matilda crews burned alive because they could not suppress the guns killing them? No one has ever been held accountable. And the proof that it was solvable? The Australians did it themselves. Fighting in the Pacific with the same Matildas, they independently developed their own 2-pounder high-explosive round in 1943 and issued it from 1944. If Australia could do it alone, why could not Britain? But the missing shell was only half the problem, because there was a better gun ready and waiting the entire time. The Ordnance QF 6-pounder was the designated replacement for the inadequate 2-pounder. It was more powerful, more accurate, and capable of firing effective high-explosive ammunition. It was designed and ready in prototype form by 1940. It did not reach front-line service until May 1942. That's a 2-year gap. 2 years of crews dying with an inferior weapon while the better guns sat waiting in warehouses. The calculation was coldly bureaucratic. Manufacturing 100 6-pounders would displace production of 600 2-pounders. Facing possible German invasion in the summer of 1940, authorities chose quantity over quality. Then the invasion never came. But the production priorities never changed. But here is the cruelest twist. Even if the 6-pounder had been available sooner, the Matilda could not use it. The turret ring was too small, 54 inches. The 6-pounder required a larger mounting. At least one experimental Matilda was fitted with a larger turret mounting a 6-pounder. Photographs exist showing the modified tank at a British proving ground, but remarkably, no documentation other than photographs of it remain. The Soviets tried too. In January 1942, engineers at the Chelyabinsk factory attempted to mount a 76.2 mm ZIS-5 gun in the Matilda turret, but found it impractical. Every single Matilda crew was locked into fighting with an obsolete weapon for the tank's entire service life. The design could not be upgraded, and nobody stopped building them. If you are still here, you are the kind of person who wants to know what actually happened, not the version they put in the history books. That is exactly why I make these videos. Hit subscribe. I dig into stories like this every week. Now let me show you who paid the price for all of this. The Matilda II was manufactured by 6 different firms across Britain. Vulcan Foundry in Lancashire was the primary contractor. The others were Ruston and Hornsby in Lincoln, John Fowler and Company in Leeds, London Midland and Scottish Railway in Derby, Harland and Wolff in Belfast, the company that built the Titanic, and North British Locomotive Company in Glasgow. None of them had ever built tanks before. They were locomotive and shipbuilding companies. Total production reached 2,987 tanks between 1937 and August 1943. Look at the timing. Peak output was 1,330 tanks in 1942, the year the Matilda was demonstrably outclassed by every German weapon system in North Africa. Crews were being massacred at Halfaya Pass, Sidi Rezeg, and a dozen other killing fields across the Libyan desert, and the factories were running at maximum capacity. The final order for 75 tanks from John Fowler was placed in spring 1942. The last 143 tanks completed in 1943 have been described by historians as effectively useless. The Imperial War Museum's assessment is damning. They concluded that tank policy was not properly synchronized between the War Office, the Ministry of Supply, and the manufacturers until the end of 1942. 6 major firms had active contracts. The Matilda required skilled machining of complex armor castings at specialized foundries. Retooling for new designs was not easy, and more than 1,000 Matildas were promised to the Soviet Union and Australia under Lend-Lease agreements, giving further justification for keeping the production lines running. Nobody stopped the machine, and inside those machines were men who trusted the armor that could not protect them. At point 206 during Operation Battleaxe, Corporal Bill Newman of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment was serving as gunner in Captain Austin's Matilda when enemy fire set the tank ablaze. Austin was hit by shrapnel. He and the radio operator dismounted through the escape hatch, both wounded. Newman stayed inside. Despite burns to his face, arms, and legs, he ordered the driver to keep advancing across the desert toward the German positions. He extinguished the fire alone, using the onboard extinguisher. He loaded the main gun himself, aimed through the smoke-filled turret, and fired. He loaded again, aimed again, and fired again, all while his skin was burning and the ammunition was cooking off around him. He kept fighting until the tank was finally knocked out by a direct hit from an 88mm round. His citation for the Distinguished Conduct Medal reads that his devotion to duty sets an example as fine as any in the history of the service. Captain Philip Gardner of the 4th Royal Tank Regiment earned both the Military Cross and the Victoria Cross fighting in Matildas across North Africa. At Halfaya Pass during Operation Battleaxe, his tank struck a minefield laid by German engineers. Lieutenant Rowe, attempting to dismount, stepped on a mine and lost both legs, an arm, and an eye. Gardner climbed out of his tank and walked through enemy shelling and machine gun fire across the open desert to reach him. He administered first aid while rounds kicked up sand around them. He then walked back across the minefield to get morphine from the medical kit and returned to Rowe. Later, during the Tobruk breakout in November 1941, Gardner dismounted from his tank under heavy fire from German positions to rescue another legless officer from a destroyed armored car. He hitched tow ropes to the wreckage while being shot in the neck, arm, and leg. His loader operator was killed beside him by machine gun fire. Gardner was captured when Tobruk fell to Rommel in June 1942, and he spent the rest of the war as a prisoner of war in camps across Italy and Germany. These men deserved better than what they were given. But the worst was yet to come. During Operation Crusader in November 1941, the 7th Armored Brigade was ordered to charge directly across open desert at German positions near the Sidi Rezeg airfield. They drove straight into 88mm gun screens that the commanders knew were there. The same tactic had failed at Arras in France. The same tactic had failed at Halfaya Pass 5 months earlier. And they did it again, and again, and again. The same charge was ordered for 4 consecutive days. The 22nd Armored Brigade lost 45 of 79 tanks in 4 hours on the second day alone. Across the 4 days of fighting around Sidi Rezeg, approximately 300 British tanks were destroyed by German guns. The wrecks burned across the desert like funeral pyres. Whether this represents catastrophic communication failure between commanders or willful disregard for crew safety remains one of the war's most troubling questions. These weren't statistics. They were fathers, sons, brothers, men who climbed into tanks they believed would protect them and burned alive when they did not. The evidence does not support a single, centralized conspiracy to suppress the Matildas' failures. What it reveals is something arguably worse: a pattern of negligence by accumulation, where no single decision was criminally reckless, but the aggregate effect was lethal. The 2-pounder high-explosive shell that existed but was never produced. The 6-pounder gun that was ready but delayed 2 years. The 88mm intelligence from Arras that was never translated into tactical doctrine. The production lines that peaked output in the year the tank was obsolete. The cavalry charge tactics repeated over 4 consecutive days at Sidi Rezeg. And there is one final piece to this puzzle. Over 1,000 British 3.7-inch anti-aircraft guns stood idle in depots across the Middle East, while Matilda crews were being slaughtered by German 88mm guns doing exactly the same job. The 3.7-inch gun was technically superior to the German weapon. It fired a heavier 28-pound shell that could destroy any tank in the world at extreme range. But institutional rigidity within the Royal Artillery prevented its deployment in the anti-tank role. It was classified as an anti-aircraft weapon. Direct fire sights were reportedly not issued to battery commanders to prevent what officials called misuse. The Germans had no such limitations. They put the 88mm wherever it was needed. The Matilda's story is not a simple tale of a bad tank. Against the Italians in the desert and the Japanese in the Pacific, it was formidable. It is a story about what happens when institutional incentives, political pressure, doctrinal rigidity, and bureaucratic inertia align to keep sending men into situations that evidence already shows are unsurvivable. Winston Churchill needed victories for political survival during the darkest days of 1941. 6 factories needed contracts to keep workers employed. The infantry tank doctrine needed validation from the theorists who had championed it. And the Queen of the Desert mythology needed protecting in the newspapers. No one ordered crews to die. But no one stopped the machine that was killing them either. Major Miles's last words from Halfaya Pass should have been the eulogy for a doctrine. They are tearing my tanks to pieces, not just for a squadron. The men who crewed those tanks deserved better than they got, and they deserve to be remembered for what they actually faced, not the propaganda version. If this story meant something to you, if you believe that the men who fought and died deserve the truth even when that truth makes powerful people uncomfortable, then subscribe. Hit the bell. I am going to keep digging into stories like this one. The tank scandal did not end with the Matilda. Click the video on screen now to see what happened when Churchill's obsession with speed created an even bigger disaster. And if you know someone who served, or whose grandfather served in tanks, share this with them. They deserve to know what really happened. Until next time.